My brother borrowed $3,400 from me and somehow convinced himself I owed him money instead. A year later, I watched security drag him out of a public seminar while he screamed that homeownership was unethical. And that was the moment my family finally realized I wasn't the villain. I never thought I'd watch my older brother get escorted out of a community center by security while screaming about economics. Yet there I was, standing near the back of a crowded seminar room holding a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold almost an hour earlier. My mother was crying. My father looked completely defeated. My sister kept whispering, "Please stop recording. Please stop recording." And David was standing on a folding chair in the middle of the room shouting into a microphone. "You don't understand," he yelled. "Financial ownership is a psychological illusion. Wealth belongs to whoever benefits from it emotionally." The room was silent. A few people exchanged nervous glances. Several others pulled out their phones. The event organizer looked seconds away from passing out. 2 security guards slowly approached David. That only made him louder. "No one here understands modern economic consciousness," he shouted. I closed my eyes. A year earlier, I would have been embarrassed. 6 months earlier, I would have been angry. By that point, I was just exhausted. Because the truth was that none of this should have happened. Not the screaming, not the harassment, not the lawsuits, not the family drama, not the complete destruction of our relationship. It all started because my brother borrowed money and didn't want to pay it back. $3,400, that was it. $3,400 turned into 12 months of manipulation, gaslighting, family arguments, public humiliation, and eventually a complete mental collapse. The first security guard reached David. "Sir, we're going to need you to step down." David pointed across the room directly at me. "There he is," he shouted. Every head turned. I immediately wished I could disappear. "That's Michael," the room continued staring. "He's the reason society is broken." I rubbed my forehead. "Here we go again." "He hoards resources," David yelled. One of the security guards tried taking the microphone. David pulled it away. "He owns property and still expects people to repay loans. How is that ethical?" A few people laughed. The sound echoed through the room. David froze. For the first time all evening, he seemed confused. Like he genuinely didn't understand why nobody was agreeing with him. The guards finally removed the microphone. David continued yelling as they escorted him toward the exit. "Michael owes me." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The doors closed behind him. Silence, complete silence. Then my mother walked over. Her eyes were red. Her voice trembled. "What happened to him?" I stared at the closed doors. I honestly didn't know how to answer. Because the man she was asking about wasn't the brother I grew up with. At least I didn't think he was. The brother I knew had always been irresponsible, always impulsive, always looking for shortcuts. But this was different. This was something else entirely. The worst part wasn't the money. It wasn't even the lies. It was realizing how many people had spent the last year convincing me I was somehow the problem. That I was selfish for wanting repayment. That I was greedy for expecting accountability. That I should simply let it go because family mattered more than money. Funny how nobody said family mattered more than money when David was borrowing mine. As I stood there staring at those closed doors, I couldn't stop thinking about the phone call that started everything. A simple request for help. A favor between brothers. A mistake that would eventually tear our family apart. And if I had known what that phone call would lead to, I never would have answered. "My name is Michael. I'm 34 years old. I work as an accountant. My life is about as exciting as a spreadsheet. And honestly, I like it that way. I like stability. I like routine. I like knowing exactly how much money is in my bank account. I like paying bills on time. I like living within my means." My older brother David was the complete opposite. Growing up, David was what people politely call a free spirit. My parents called him creative. My teachers called him gifted. My friends called him unpredictable. I called him exhausting. David always had a new dream. A new business, a new investment, a new plan that was supposedly going to make him rich. And every single time those plans failed, someone else cleaned up the mess, usually my parents. When David dropped out of college, they supported him. When he lost jobs, they supported him. When he couldn't pay rent, they supported him. When relationships fell apart because of his irresponsibility, they blamed the girlfriends. Nothing was ever David's fault. Meanwhile, I became the responsible child. Not because I wanted praise, because somebody had to live in reality. I worked through college, built savings, avoided debt, bought a reliable used car, and eventually purchased a small apartment. Nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, decent neighborhood, paid off after years of careful budgeting. I wasn't rich, not even close. I was simply financially stable. But somewhere along the way, David started resenting that. At family dinners, he'd make little comments. Must be nice. You've got life figured out. I wish I had your luck. The word luck always bothered me. Because luck didn't explain 10 years of budgeting. Luck didn't explain overtime shifts. Luck didn't explain skipped vacations and careful planning. But I usually ignored it. I loved my brother, even when he annoyed me. Even when he frustrated me. Even when he made terrible decisions. I genuinely wanted him to succeed. Which is why when he called me one Thursday evening sounding stressed and desperate, I didn't hesitate to help. That decision would become the biggest mistake of my adult life. The first time David asked for money, it didn't seem like a big deal. It was a Thursday evening around 8 o'clock when my phone rang. I remember because I was halfway through making dinner. David sounded stressed. Not his usual dramatic stressed where everything was supposedly falling apart. This sounded genuine. Mike, I need a favor. I immediately knew where the conversation was heading. Nobody starts a phone call with those words unless money is involved. What's going on? David sighed heavily. My client payment got delayed. Rent is due tomorrow. I'm short a few $100s. I didn't even think about it. How much? 400. That's it. Yeah, I'll pay you back next week. I transferred the money before we hung up. Simple, easy, normal. That's what brothers do for each other, or at least that's what I thought. The next week came and went. No repayment, no mention of repayment. I wasn't worried. It was $400. Then about 3 weeks later, he called again. This time it was a utility bill, then a car repair, then a business expense, then another temporary emergency. Every request came with a promise. I'll pay you back soon. I just need a little more time. Everything's about to turn around. Months passed. The amount slowly grew. 500 here, 300 there, 200 somewhere else. I kept telling myself it wasn't a big deal. David was my brother. He'd eventually get back on his feet. He'd eventually repay me. That's what family does. By the end of 6 months, the total had reached around $3,400. That was the moment I decided it was time to have a conversation. Not an argument, not a confrontation. Just a conversation. So one Saturday afternoon I called him. Hey, have you thought about a repayment plan? The silence on the other end surprised me. Then David laughed. Not a friendly laugh, not a nervous laugh, a bitter laugh. A repayment plan? Yeah, another silence. Then he said something that completely caught me off guard. You really keep track of that stuff? I frowned. Of course I do. It's family, Michael. Exactly. No, I mean it's family. I could hear irritation creeping into his voice, as though I had somehow offended him. You make it sound like I'm some stranger who owes you money. I blinked. You do owe me money. Another silence. Then he laughed again, that same bitter laugh. For the first time in my life, I felt something strange. Not anger, confusion, because David genuinely sounded offended, like I had broken some unspoken rule. The conversation ended awkwardly. No repayment plan, no timeline. No accountability, just excuses. When I hung up, I remember staring at my phone and thinking something felt different. Something had shifted. The problem wasn't that David couldn't repay me. The problem was that he didn't think he should have to. And once that idea entered his head, everything started getting worse. Over the next few weeks, he became noticeably defensive whenever money came up. If I mentioned repayment, he changed the subject. If I asked for updates, he accused me of being impatient. One day he actually said something that left me speechless. You act like money is more important than family. I almost laughed, because that statement made absolutely no sense. I wasn't the one refusing to honor an agreement. I wasn't the one borrowing money and pretending it didn't matter. But somehow the situation was already being reframed. David wasn't becoming the bad guy. I was. At the time, I thought it was just denial. I thought he was embarrassed. I thought he was struggling. I wanted to give him grace. What I didn't realize was that David had already started rewriting the story in his own head. A story where he wasn't indebted to me. A story where I was somehow exploiting him. And unfortunately, he wasn't the only person who would start believing it. Because the next major fight happened during a family dinner. And by the end of that evening, I would discover just how willing my family was to take David's side, even when he was completely wrong. A few weeks later, my parents invited everyone over for Sunday dinner. At first, everything seemed normal. My mother cooked enough food to feed an army. My father watched sports in the living room. My sister Emily talked about work. For a while, everything felt comfortable. Then David brought up money, not his money, my money, which should have been my first warning sign. We were halfway through dinner when he suddenly looked at me and said, "Michael's been hounding me lately." The room went quiet. I looked up. "Hounding you? About money?" My stomach immediately dropped. I knew exactly where this was going. My mother frowned. "What money?" David let out a dramatic sigh. "The money I borrowed." My father shrugged. "Just pay him back." Simple, reasonable, logical. The conversation should have ended right there. Instead, David shook his head. "It's not that simple." I remember staring at him because yes, it absolutely was that simple. You borrow money, you repay money. That's literally how loans work. But David leaned back in his chair and began talking as if he were delivering a lecture. "Michael already owns an apartment." The room fell silent. I blinked. What did that have to do with anything? My sister nodded slowly. "That's true." I stared at her. "What's true?" "You already own property." I felt my confusion growing. "Okay," David spread his hands dramatically. "So why do you need the money?" For a moment I genuinely thought he was joking. Then I realized he was completely serious. The room became uncomfortable. My mother shifted in her chair. My father looked confused. David continued. "You've already won, Mike." Won what? Life, adulthood, financial responsibility. What exactly had I won? I spent years saving for that apartment, years sacrificing things I wanted, years making careful decisions. Yet David talked about it like I'd won some kind of lottery. "You don't understand," he continued. "When people already have enough, demanding repayment becomes greed." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "David, it's my money. You don't need it." The statement hit me harder than I expected. Not because it was logical, because it revealed exactly how he viewed me. In his mind, ownership automatically created obligation. If I had something he didn't have, then I somehow owed him access to it. And the worst part? Some family members seemed sympathetic. Emily looked uncertain. My mother looked uncomfortable. Nobody immediately called out how ridiculous the argument was. Nobody said, "That's not how borrowing money works." Instead, they started talking about understanding, compassion, patience, family support, all wonderful concepts, none of which explained why I should permanently lose $3,400. By the end of dinner, I felt like I was defending myself for expecting basic accountability. And that was the first moment I realized this wasn't really about the loan anymore. This was becoming something much bigger, something stranger, something far more dangerous, because David wasn't just refusing repayment. He was building an entire philosophy around why he shouldn't have to repay me. And soon that philosophy would become completely insane. If you told me a year earlier that my brother would eventually argue that I owed him money after borrowing $3,400 from me, I would have laughed in your face. Not because it was impossible, because it was too ridiculous even for David. Unfortunately, I underestimated how far someone can go when they become determined to avoid accountability. After that disastrous family dinner, David's behavior changed. Instead of avoiding conversations about the loan, he started seeking them out. At first, I thought it was a good sign. Maybe he'd finally accepted reality. Maybe he wanted to discuss a payment plan. Maybe he was ready to act like an adult. I was wrong. One Saturday morning, he invited me to a coffee shop. His message sounded unusually serious. "I think we need to have a deeper discussion about the debt situation." The phrase debt situation should have been my warning. I arrived 10 minutes early. David showed up carrying a notebook, not a small notebook. A thick spiral-bound notebook filled with tabs, sticky notes, and handwritten pages. The second I saw it, my stomach dropped. This wasn't going to be a normal conversation. David sat down across from me and immediately opened the notebook. "Before we start," he said, "I need you to approach this with an open mind." Whenever someone says that, you're about to hear something insane. I nodded cautiously. David flipped through several pages. Then he pointed to a diagram about the money he owed me. "Over the last few months," he began, "I've been researching economic psychology." I already hated where this was going. He continued anyway, "You've been viewing our financial arrangement through a traditional ownership framework." I stared at him. "My what?" "Our financial arrangement." "The loan." He looked annoyed. "That's a very outdated way of describing it." I blinked several times. The loan was outdated. It had happened 6 months ago. What was he talking about? David tapped the notebook. "I've realized something important." I said nothing. "You benefited from lending me money." I waited. Surely there was more. There wasn't. That was the statement. "You benefited from lending me money." I laughed. I genuinely thought he was joking. David didn't laugh. His expression remained completely serious. "I'm serious, Michael. How exactly did I benefit? He smiled, the smile of a man who thought he'd discovered something profound. Emotionally. I almost spit out my coffee. Emotionally? Yes, he leaned forward. When you helped me, you experienced satisfaction. I stared at him. You felt useful, still staring. You gained emotional value from helping another person. I couldn't believe this conversation was real. David nodded confidently. So in a way, I provided something too. I looked around the coffee shop to make sure hidden cameras weren't filming a prank show. Unfortunately, nobody seemed interested in our conversation. Meaning this nightmare was real. David, I said slowly, that's not how loans work. He immediately shook his head. That's how traditional loans work. The confidence was what made it terrifying. He genuinely believed this. Or at least wanted to believe it. Then things got worse. Much worse. Because David pulled out several pages filled with calculations. Actual calculations, numbers, charts, arrows, percentages. He slid them across the table. I looked down. At the top of the page were 4 words. Psychological interest analysis. I wish I were making that up. Underneath was a bizarre formula attempting to calculate the emotional benefits I had supposedly received by helping him. According to David's calculations, I had gained approximately $4,200 worth of emotional satisfaction. Which meant, and yes, he actually said this, I technically owed him money. I sat there in complete silence, trying to decide whether to laugh or walk away. David interpreted my silence as interest. The system is revolutionary. No, it completely redefines debt. No, it could change economics forever. No, he frowned. You haven't even considered it. I rubbed my temples. David, you borrowed money. You gained emotional fulfillment. You borrowed money. You enjoyed helping family. You borrowed money. You felt morally superior. I closed my eyes. At that moment, I realized something important. This wasn't about logic. This wasn't about money. This wasn't about fairness. David had reached a point where reality itself was becoming negotiable. Any fact he didn't like could simply be replaced. Any obligation could be redefined. Any responsibility could be transferred. And the scary part? He was becoming more confident every week, not less. When I got home, I told myself the situation couldn't get any stranger. I was wrong, because David wasn't keeping these theories private anymore. He was sharing them with our family. And somehow, against all odds, some of them were actually listening. By the time I decided to take him to court, I wasn't trying to recover $3,400 anymore. I was trying to prove I wasn't losing my mind. And that decision would change everything. Taking your own brother to court feels awful. I don't care how justified you are. I don't care how much evidence you have. The moment you file the paperwork, something inside you realizes the relationship may never recover. For weeks, I resisted it. I kept hoping David would come to his senses. I kept hoping my family would intervene. I kept hoping somebody would look at this situation objectively and say, David, repay the money and move on. Instead, the opposite happened. David became more aggressive, more confident, more convinced that he was right. And the more he talked, the more bizarre his explanations became. Eventually, I stopped seeing a path forward. The final straw came during another family gathering. My father casually asked David if he'd made any progress on repayment. David laughed, actually laughed. Then he said, repayment is an outdated concept. The room went silent. My father stared at him. My mother stared at him. Even Emily looked confused. But David just kept talking. Michael's thinking is rooted in scarcity. That was the moment I made my decision. A week later, I filed in small claims court. The amount wasn't huge, the process was straightforward, and most importantly, I had evidence. Bank transfers, text messages, emails. Conversations where David explicitly acknowledged the loan. I wasn't worried about winning. I was worried about what would happen afterward. When David received notice of the hearing, he called me immediately. Furious. You're actually doing this? Yes. You'd sue your own brother. You'd refuse to repay your own brother? Silence. Then he hung up. The court date arrived 3 weeks later, and somehow, unbelievably, David showed up carrying that notebook. The same notebook, the psychological interest notebook. The judge had absolutely no idea what was coming. The morning of the hearing felt surreal. I arrived early. David arrived 20 minutes later carrying his notebook under one arm and a reusable grocery bag stuffed with papers. That should have worried me. Instead, I felt strangely calm. Because for the first time in almost a year, this situation was about to be judged by someone who wasn't emotionally involved. No family loyalty, no guilt, no childhood history, just facts. The courtroom itself was small, nothing dramatic like television, just a judge, a clerk, and several people waiting for their own cases. David sat across from me and refused to make eye contact. Every few minutes he'd pull papers from his bag and rearrange them. He looked less like someone preparing for court and more like a college student cramming for an exam he hadn't studied for. Eventually our case was called. We approached the front. The judge looked through the paperwork, then he glanced at both of us. "So this is a dispute regarding a personal loan?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said. David immediately interrupted. "I disagree with that characterization." The judge looked up. "Excuse me?" David straightened his shoulders. "This matter is significantly more complex than a loan." I felt my stomach drop. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead." David looked thrilled, like someone had just invited him to deliver a TED Talk. For the next several minutes he explained his theory, his psychological interest theory, his emotional benefit calculations, his belief that traditional debt structures were obsolete, his argument that helping someone creates value for the lender, his claim that emotional satisfaction should be considered a form of compensation. The courtroom became completely silent. At one point I noticed the clerk staring at him with a look of genuine confusion. Even the judge seemed uncertain whether David was joking. Unfortunately, he wasn't. He was deadly serious. Eventually, David pulled out charts, actual charts, then graphs, then handwritten calculations. He spent nearly 10 minutes explaining why my emotional fulfillment exceeded the value of the money he'd borrowed. According to his math, I had gained approximately $4,200 in emotional profit, which meant I technically owed him around $800. The silence afterward was painful. The judge slowly removed his glasses, looked at the papers, looked at David, then looked at me. For a second I thought he might start laughing. Instead he asked a single question. "Did you borrow the money?" David hesitated. "That's not the relevant issue." The judge repeated himself. "Did you borrow the money?" "Yes." "Did you agree to repay it?" David shifted uncomfortably. "Under a traditional framework, did you agree to repay it?" "Yes." The judge nodded, then turned toward me. "Do you have evidence?" I handed over printed bank transfers, text messages, and emails. Several messages explicitly stated things like, "I'll pay you back next month. Thanks for the loan. Sorry I'm late repaying you." Simple, clear, undeniable. The judge reviewed everything, then spent less than 2 minutes making his decision. Judgment for the plaintiff, full amount owed. Court costs included. Done, finished. Reality had won, at least temporarily. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt sick. Because while the legal battle was over, I knew David wasn't going to accept the result. The moment we stepped outside, he confronted me. His face was red. "You manipulated the system." I blinked. "What? You knew the court would use outdated financial models." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The judge had literally asked if he borrowed money. David had admitted he borrowed money. Case closed, but somehow he still viewed himself as the victim. "This isn't over," he said. I remember staring at him, trying to find some trace of the brother I used to know, trying to find some sign that this was all temporary. Instead, I saw something unsettling. Conviction. Absolute conviction. David genuinely believed he'd been wronged. That realization scared me more than anything he'd said in court. Because people who know they're wrong eventually stop. People who believe they're right never do. And unfortunately, David was just getting started. The court victory didn't end the conflict. It made it worse. Much worse. Because after losing publicly, David became obsessed with proving he was right, and his obsession would soon spill into every part of my life, including my job, my reputation, and eventually an entire community seminar where everything finally fell apart. For about 2 weeks after court, things were quiet, too quiet. I should have known better. David had never handled failure well. But this wasn't ordinary failure. This was official, documented, public. A judge had looked at his arguments and rejected them completely. For most people, that would have been the end. For David, it became the beginning of a new mission. At first, it was social media. He started posting long essays about economic oppression. Most of them barely made sense. He'd write paragraphs about emotional wealth extraction and psychological ownership structures. Almost nobody understood what he was talking about. But David didn't seem to care. Then he created a website, a real website. According to David, he had founded something called the Institute for Ethical Resource Distribution, which sounds impressive until you realize the institute consisted of one person. David. The website featured articles he wrote himself, research papers he wrote himself, and references that mostly linked back to other articles he wrote himself. I wish I were exaggerating. At first I ignored it. Then he started mentioning me, not by name, but clearly enough. He described me as a property-owning family member who exploited economic privilege. My friends started sending screenshots. Coworkers started asking questions. One afternoon, my manager called me into her office. "Michael, is everything okay?" The second she asked, I knew. David had contacted my workplace. My stomach dropped. "What happened?" she sighed. "We received a very unusual email." Of course they did. The email accused me of financial exploitation, psychological profiteering, economic dominance, and several other phrases that sounded like they'd been generated by a malfunctioning philosophy textbook. Thankfully, my manager was reasonable. After reading the email for 30 seconds, she realized it was nonsense. Still, the embarrassment was brutal. I was a professional accountant. The last thing I needed was my brother sending bizarre manifestos to my employer. When I confronted him, he seemed confused. "I'm spreading awareness. You're harassing me." "No, David, you contacted my workplace." They deserved context. That sentence chilled me, because he truly didn't see boundaries anymore. Every disagreement had become a crusade. Every consequence had become proof of persecution. And every attempt to reason with him only convinced him he was more right. By that point, even Emily was starting to pull away. The theories were becoming too strange, too disconnected from reality. For the first time, cracks were appearing in the support system that had protected David his entire life. But instead of slowing down, he accelerated. A few months later, he announced he would be speaking at a community seminar, an actual public event. According to David, this was his opportunity to educate people about modern economics. My family begged me not to attend. I should have listened, because that seminar would become the moment everything finally collapsed, the moment nobody could deny what was happening anymore, the moment David exposed himself in front of an entire room full of strangers, and the moment my family was finally forced to confront the truth they'd spent months avoiding. By the time David announced his community seminar, almost a year had passed since he first borrowed money from me. A year. A year of arguments. A year of accusations. A year of watching someone I loved drift further and further away from reality. The event was being held at a local community center. According to the promotional flyer, David would be presenting a lecture called "The Future of Ethical Resource Distribution." Even the title sounded exhausting. I had no intention of attending. None. But then my sister called. "Mom and Dad are going," I sighed. "Okay. They think maybe this will help him." That sentence hurt, because deep down I think we all knew it wouldn't. Still, part of me understood why they wanted to believe. Nobody wants to admit a family member is unraveling. Nobody wants to admit things have gotten that bad. So on a rainy Thursday evening, I found myself sitting near the back of a community center, watching my brother prepare to give a speech. About 30 people showed up. Most looked confused. A few seemed genuinely interested. Several appeared to be there because they had no idea what the event was actually about. David walked onto the stage carrying the same notebook. The notebook, the one that had somehow survived family dinners, court hearings, and months of increasingly bizarre theories. He looked confident. Too confident. The kind of confidence that comes from believing you've figured out something nobody else understands. For the first 10 minutes, everything seemed normal, or at least normal by David's standards. He talked about economics, wealth inequality, community support, shared resources, nothing particularly alarming, a little unusual, a little rambling, but manageable. My parents looked relieved. Emily looked relieved. Even I started wondering if maybe we'd all been overreacting. Then someone in the audience asked a question, a simple question, the kind of question that should have taken 30 seconds to answer. A middle-aged man raised his hand. "If someone borrows money, shouldn't they repay it?" The room became quiet. I felt my stomach drop. Because I immediately knew where this was going, David smiled. Then he launched into the psychological interest theory. Again, the audience looked confused, then skeptical, then visibly uncomfortable. People started exchanging glances. The man who asked the question frowned. "So you're saying borrowers don't have to repay loans?" David shook his head. "No, I'm saying repayment should account for emotional compensation." The man blinked. "What does that mean?" David smiled wider. Then he used me as an example, without naming me directly. But everyone who knew the story understood exactly who he was talking about. He explained how a family member had loaned him money, how that family member benefited emotionally, how traditional debt systems ignored emotional value, how he was actually the victim. People started laughing, not cruelly, not maliciously, just genuine disbelief. And for the first time, David seemed irritated, then angry, then frustrated. The more people questioned him, the more defensive he became. The more defensive he became, the stranger his answers got. Soon he wasn't talking about loans anymore. He was talking about ownership itself, then property, then morality, then emotional entitlement. At one point he argued that people who owned homes had an ethical obligation to support relatives indefinitely. The audience wasn't buying it. Nobody was, and David could feel it. The room was slipping away from him. The validation he expected wasn't coming. The applause wasn't coming. Agreement wasn't coming. For a moment I almost felt sorry for him. Then he pointed directly at me. "There he is." The room turned, every head, every single head. I wanted to disappear. "That's Michael," my mother gasped. Emily covered her face. And suddenly David wasn't giving a seminar anymore. He was having a meltdown. "He exploited me." Nobody responded. "He profited from my struggles." Silence. "He thinks ownership gives him power." A few people started gathering their things. The event organizer looked horrified. David's voice grew louder, then louder, then louder, until security finally stepped in. Everything after that happened fast. Arguments, shouting, confusion, the microphone being taken away, the folding chair, the screaming. And finally the sight of my brother being escorted out while insisting he was the smartest person in the room. The seminar ended early. Most people left immediately. Nobody knew what to say, not even my family. For the first time in a year there were no excuses, no explanations, no both sides arguments, no claims that I should be more understanding. Everyone had seen it. Everyone. The drive home was silent. A few days later my parents called me. They wanted to talk. When I arrived, they looked exhausted, completely exhausted. My mother cried almost immediately. My father stared at the floor. Then my father said something I'd been waiting a year to hear. "We should have listened to you." Not because I wanted an apology, because I needed them to understand. I hadn't been trying to punish David. I hadn't been trying to hurt him. I'd been trying to deal with a problem nobody else wanted to acknowledge. Over the following weeks, the situation became clearer. Medical evaluations, doctor appointments, conversations nobody wanted to have. Eventually, we received answers. David was dealing with serious mental health issues that had likely been escalating for months, maybe longer. Suddenly, a lot of things made sense. The grand theories, the obsession, the certainty, the increasingly disconnected logic, the public behavior, everything. But understanding something doesn't erase the damage, and that was the hardest lesson of all. Because while the diagnosis explained David's actions, it didn't undo them. It didn't repair our relationship. It didn't erase the lies. It didn't erase the court case. It didn't erase the humiliation. Most importantly, it didn't magically restore trust. The months that followed were complicated. David got help. My parents became more involved. Emily apologized for taking his side. Even my father admitted he'd ignored warning signs because he wanted to believe everything would work itself out. As for me, I created boundaries, real boundaries, for the first time in my life. Not because I stopped loving my brother, because I finally understood that loving someone doesn't mean allowing them to hurt you. The funniest part, the money eventually stopped mattering, not because I got it back. Although I eventually did through the court judgment. The money stopped mattering because it was never really about money. The $3,400 was just the spark. The real issue was entitlement, accountability, trust, and how quickly people can convince themselves they're victims when reality becomes uncomfortable. Today, things are better. Not perfect, but better. David is receiving help. My family is healing slowly. And I've learned something valuable. If someone borrows money and gets angry when you ask for repayment, the problem isn't the money. The problem is what that request reveals. Because honest people may struggle. They may be embarrassed. They may need time, but they don't rewrite reality to avoid accountability. And they certainly don't create a theory explaining why you owe them money for helping them. Looking back, the hardest part wasn't losing $3,400. It wasn't the court case. It wasn't the public embarrassment. The hardest part was realizing how many people expected me to sacrifice my boundaries simply because I appeared stable. As if responsibility somehow created obligation. As if success automatically meant surrender. But here's what I finally learned. You can love your family, you can help your family, you can support your family, and you can still say no when someone decides your generosity belongs to them, because kindness is a gift, not a debt. And the moment someone starts treating it like one, they're no longer asking for help. They're demanding ownership. And that's a lesson worth far more than $3,400.